They had surrendered thousands of miles from home, their weapons stacked in piles, their uniforms heavy with dust and defeat. From the moment they laid down their rifles, one thought consumed them: captivity would be cruel. For years, Nazi propaganda had repeated the same message. The Americans were monsters. They would beat you, starve you, work you until your body broke. Some were even told they would be experimented on like animals. It was a vision of endless misery, and most believed it. Every mile they marched under guard seemed to confirm their fear. Each checkpoint, each train station, felt like the edge of a darker descent. No one spoke of mercy, no one imagined comfort. The men braced themselves for a life stripped of dignity, and then, almost without warning, the story changed. Behind barbed wire and the watchful eyes of armed guards, something unthinkable appeared. A bottle was pressed into the hand of a prisoner. Clear glass, cold to the touch, filled with a dark, fizzing liquid. The cap hissed open, and for the first time many of them saw the word Pepsi. Nearby, another soldier was handed a hot dog, steam curling into the air, the smell of grilled meat spreading across the yard. For a moment, the men froze. Some laughed nervously, others whispered. Could this really be happening? They had imagined chains, not soda. They had expected scraps of mouldy bread, not warm food fresh from a grill. Suspicion clung to every gesture. Surely it was poisoned, or some twisted trick designed to soften them before harsher punishments began. But hunger and curiosity were stronger than fear. The first sip of Pepsi carried a rush of sweetness that felt unreal after years of scarcity. The first bite of the hot dog was salty, smoky, and rich, almost impossible to reconcile with the hunger that haunted their memories. Soldiers who had crossed deserts and frozen fields on black bread and watery soup now sat stunned, chewing in silence. It was more than food, it was a message. America had so much it could feed its enemies like honored guests. Every bubble of soda, every bite of meat, told them something their leaders had never admitted. They were prisoners in a land of impossible abundance. And as they swallowed, one thought echoed among them. If this was captivity, what else awaited in America? When German soldiers first laid down their weapons in North Africa, France, and Italy, a heavy silence fell over them. For years they had been told that capture meant degradation. In every village, every barracks, rumours swirled of prisoners beaten by guards, driven into mines, or left to waste away in cages. Mothers had whispered such warnings to their sons. Officers had repeated them before campaigns. The message was constant: if you fall into American hands, your life is finished. That fear hung over every column of men as they were marched away. Some stared at the boots of the guards, waiting for the first kick. Others imagined themselves starved into skeletons, their strength squeezed out of them until nothing remained. Their imagination supplied endless variations of torment, yet the hours passed and nothing came. The Americans were watchful, but not vicious. They carried their rifles, but they spoke with each other in relaxed tones, even joked as they walked. When a canteen was offered or a cigarette passed around, it felt less like captivity than some strange accident. The prisoners whispered among themselves that it must be a trap, a trick designed to confuse them before the true cruelty began. The transports only deepened the confusion. Instead of being shoved into filthy cattle cars, they found themselves seated in proper rail compartments. Guards sat near the doors, but the men had space to breathe. On ships crossing the Atlantic, they were not thrown into the bowels of the hold with no air, but given bunks, basic meals, and time on deck. For soldiers hardened by years of war, it was baffling. They had expected humiliation at every step. Instead, they were treated with a kind of strict efficiency, as if their captors had no interest in breaking them down at all. Food became the first shock that pierced their certainty. White bread appeared on the tables, thick slices soft to the touch. Meat, coffee, even fruit were set before men who had marched for weeks on crusts and thin soup. Suspicion, again, was instinctive. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was laced with drugs. But hunger always wins. By the second or third meal, disbelief had turned into silent astonishment. Men who had grown up under rationing now stared at their plates as though they had stumbled into another world. Still, they remained cautious. The common explanation was that the Americans wanted to keep them strong for brutal labor. Others feared they were being fattened for medical experiments, so deep was the influence of propaganda at home. Even kindness was terrifying when it contradicted everything you had been told. As the ships neared their destination, the coast of the United States rose on the horizon. Towers of steel and smoke stretched upward, cranes swung over harbors alive with motion. Factories, warehouses, endless rows of trucks and trains filled their vision. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming. This was not the distant caricature painted in speeches, a land of weak and decadent people. This was an empire of industry, roaring with energy, so vast that even its prisoners could not be ignored. Through the bus and truck windows on their way inland, the surprises continued. Wide fields stretched farther than the eye could follow. Small towns lined with neon signs and gasoline stations flickered in the night. Children waved as the convoys passed, and townspeople gathered to glimpse the defeated soldiers. The prisoners returned the stares with equal fascination. Ordinary Americans seemed untouched by war. Shops were full, houses stood intact, cars rolled smoothly along broad roads. It was a vision that gnawed at the minds of men who had left behind cities of rubble and families surviving on ration cards. The journey into the interior of America revealed something their leaders had never admitted. The enemy lived in comfort unimaginable to most of Europe. And if this was the beginning of captivity, the question grew louder in every mind: what else would America reveal once the gates of the camps closed behind them? The trucks slowed as they approached the camp. Rows of barbed wire fences came into view, guard towers standing at each corner, rifles glinting in the sunday. For the prisoners, it was the moment they had dreaded since capture. This, they thought, was where the nightmare would finally begin. Some muttered quiet prayers. Others clenched their jaws, preparing themselves for violence. Yet when the gates opened, what greeted them was not chaos but order. Guards directed the trucks calmly. Prisoners were unloaded, counted, and marched in lines through wide gates. The process was strict, but it lacked the cruelty they expected. There was no shouting in their ears, no blows from rifle butts. Instead, men were guided toward registration tables, where clerks wrote down their names and assigned them numbers. It felt more like a factory line than a scene of punishment. The barracks were another surprise. Long wooden buildings stood neatly in rows, roofs intact, windows unbroken. Inside, bunks were arranged in lines with mattresses stuffed full, not straw mats crawling with lice. Each bed had blankets folded neatly at the foot, as if awaiting their arrival. Stoves were installed for the colder months, and shelves lined the walls for personal belongings. It was not luxury, but it was organized, livable, and clean. For soldiers hardened by trench life, the sight bordered on unbelievable. The mess hall quickly became the most talked-about feature. At the appointed hour, prisoners filed into a large hall filled with long wooden tables. The smell of cooked food drifted through the air. Meatloaf, potatoes, beans, coffee, even milk. On some days, fruit appeared on the trays. The men froze at the sight. Back home, their families were standing in ration lines, scouring bombed-out markets for scraps of horse meat or turnips. German soldiers at the front often survived on black bread and watery broth. Yet here, in the custody of the enemy, their plates were fuller than they had been in years. At first, suspicion ran high. Some whispered that the food was contaminated. A few refused to eat, staring at their trays with narrowed eyes. But hunger is stronger than doubt. Bite by bite, they gave in. Soon, the the hall filled with the sound of cutlery striking plates, men chewing slowly, still bewildered. Afterwards, the whispers began again. They feed us better than our own army did. Discipline in the camp was firm but measured. Roll calls were held at dawn and dusk. Guards checked head counts, verified names, and ensured order. But punishment was not meted out with brutality. A late arrival meant confinement, not a beating. An attempted escape brought serious consequences, but rarely torture. The Americans seemed more interested in maintaining efficiency than inflicting suffering. This difference unsettled the prisoners. They had been trained to see the Allies as lawless and cruel. Instead, they found themselves under rules that, while strict, carried a strange fairness. Medical stations stood ready at the edge of the camp. Prisoners with wounds or illnesses were examined and treated. Bandages were replaced, fevers reduced, broken bones set. Many men who had marched into captivity half dead from exhaustion began to recover strength in a place they had thought would destroy them. The contradiction gnawed at them. Why would the enemy care for the health of men who had tried to kill them? Daily life unfolded in patterns the Germans had not expected. Wake-up calls were punctual, meals consistent, work assignments clear. At night, the barracks filled with tired bodies, conversations drifting into silence as men sank into sleep. The rhythm was strange but stabilizing. It gave shape to days that might otherwise have dissolved into despair. Outside the fences, the landscape of America stretched endlessly. Many camps were built in rural areas: the South, the Midwest, the Far West. Through the wire, prisoners saw fields of corn, dense forests, and small towns scattered along highways. Farmers plowed land nearby. Children sometimes waved from the distance. For men who had imagined America only through propaganda posters, the reality was startling. This was not a land of savages or ruins. It was a country of abundance, its ordinary people carrying on with life as if the war were far away. At night, the barracks buzzed with whispers. Some wondered if this strange order concealed a hidden cruelty. Others dared to suggest that perhaps America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its ability to treat even enemies with an unexpected measure of humanity. The question spread quietly from bunk to bunk. If this was a prison, then what did freedom in America look like? As the first weeks in the camps passed, the shock of arrival gave way to something stranger: routine. Each morning began with the same ritual. A whistle blew, boots struck the dirt, and long lines of prisoners assembled in the yard for roll call. Guards checked names against lists, counted heads, and corrected any confusion with brisk efficiency. It was strict, but not savage. For men accustomed to chaos on the battlefield, the order carried its own kind of relief. Breakfast followed. Trays of food were set out: oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs, and coffee strong enough to cut through the morning chill. The meals were hardly indulgent, yet compared to the gnawing hunger of the front lines, they were extraordinary. Men ate in silence, trying not to stare at the portions. Some confessed privately that they had never begun a day so well fed during the entire war. After breakfast came assignments. Not every man was required to work, but many were. Under guard, groups were marched to nearby fields, workshops, or maintenance projects inside the camp. Farm labor was common, especially in the Midwest and South. German soldiers who had once driven tanks or fired artillery now hoisted hay bales, mended fences, or picked crops. The work was physical, but it was not cruel. They were given breaks, water, and sometimes even shade when the sun grew oppressive. The shock lay in the simplicity. Soldiers who had prepared themselves for punishment instead found themselves treated like ordinary laborers. In some places, they were even given symbolic wages coupons, redeemable for small comforts at the camp canteen. Cigarettes, soap, stationery, or candy could be purchased with these tokens. For men stripped of nearly everything, The act of choosing a bar of chocolate or a packet of tobacco felt almost like freedom. Inside the camp, other jobs filled the hours. Some repaired uniforms, others worked in kitchens, cleaning and preparing meals. The most educated among them were sometimes assigned to clerical duties, copying records or assisting with paperwork. Tasks rotated and discipline ensured they were completed, but none carried the cruelty they had braced themselves for. The guards, too, shaped the rhythm of the day. They carried rifles and enforced rules, yet they did not bark endlessly or strike without reason. Many treated their duty as just another posting, a job to be done. This attitude confused the prisoners, who had expected hatred at every turn. The absence of constant aggression unsettled them more than hostility would have. Lunch arrived, then work continued. By late afternoon, men were marched back into camp, their bodies tired but not broken. Evening meals mirrored the morning, hearty, steady, and sufficient. For men who had once fought over crusts of bread in ruined cities, such consistency felt almost like luxury. After dinner, the camp settled into a quieter rhythm. Some men washed clothing, others wrote letters home with the paper and envelopes provided through the Red Cross. Many simply sat in groups, talking quietly, smoking, or staring through the fence at the fields beyond. The conversations repeated themselves in circles. Why are we being treated this way? What do the Americans want from us? The routine dulled fear, but it raised questions. Captivity began to feel less like punishment and more like a strange imitation of ordinary life. They were prisoners, yes, but their days carried structure, meals were predictable, and work was reasonable. For men who had expected torment, the pattern was bewildering. At night, when the lights dimmed in the barracks, many whispered the same thought. If this was what the enemy called imprisonment, then perhaps the stories they had been told back home had not been the whole truth. Once the prisoners had adjusted to the rhythm of roll calls, meals, and work details, another revelation emerged: leisure. It seemed impossible that a prison camp could contain space for recreation, yet the Americans had made it so. At first, it began with small gestures. A guard tossed a soccer ball into the yard, and within minutes men were shouting, running, and laughing as though the war belonged to another lifetime. Soon, whole fields inside the fences were converted into proper pitches. Teams were formed, schedules drawn up, and matches played under the watchful eyes of guards who sometimes cheered from the sidelines. To men who had been trained to march in lockstep and obey every command, the sound of laughter on a soccer field felt disorienting. Some feared it was a trap, but as weeks passed, the games became part of daily life. Volleyball nets appeared, and prisoners formed squads that competed fiercely in the evenings. Others set up chessboards and card games inside the barracks. The clack of pieces and the shuffle of cards filled the quiet hours after supper. A few men who had hidden musical talents carved instruments from scrap wood or borrowed guitars through Red Cross packages. Slowly, orchestras formed, small at first, then larger, until entire concerts were performed behind the wire. Violins, flutes, and makeshift drums accompanied voices raised in song. On summer evenings, music drifted across the camp, softening the silence of captivity. Libraries were stocked with donated books, some in German, others in English. The sight of Goethe or Schiller beside translations of Mark Twain and Jack London astonished the prisoners. Men who had known only propaganda reels now lost themselves in novels and stories. Some tried to teach themselves English by tracing words with their fingers late at night. Reading, like the soccer games, became an escape. For a few hours, the wire fence seemed to vanish, replaced by landscapes of imagination. The Red Cross delivered packages with soap, toothpaste, razors, and even chocolate. Prisoners who had expected to lose all sense of self now shaved in the mornings, washed with real soap, and felt clean for the first time in months. Writing materials were distributed as well, and letters flowed between captives and families back home. Though heavily censored, the act of writing restored dignity. Men spoke of their mothers, wives, and children, describing not just survival but small comforts. To receive a reply weeks later was to reclaim a piece of humanity stolen by war. The Americans also encouraged handicrafts. Woodworking shops were organized where prisoners carved figurines, built furniture, or whittled toys to send home. Painters used scraps of canvas to recreate landscapes remembered from childhood. For some, these crafts were more than distraction, they were therapy. To create something beautiful after years of destruction was to remember that life held meaning beyond marching and killing. Not every man embraced the opportunities. Hardliners scoffed at soccer games and orchestras, calling them distractions meant to weaken discipline. Yet, even the most resistant found it difficult to ignore the atmosphere. A game might echo outside their barrack, or music might filter through the night. Slowly, resistance softened. Recreation did not erase captivity, but it blurred the sharp edges of suffering. The effect was undeniable. In the absence of constant drills and propaganda, the camp grew less like an army in waiting and more like a strange community. Soldiers became players, readers, writers, musicians. They were still prisoners, yet in many ways they had been demilitarized without force. The transformation unsettled some, but for most it was a quiet relief. In whispers, men admitted that captivity had given them something they had lost on the battlefield, a chance to feel human again. Recreation eased the tension of captivity. But another discovery unsettled the prisoners far more deeply: access to information. One afternoon, stacks of newspapers were delivered to the camp library. At first, the Germans assumed they were propaganda sheets, carefully constructed lies meant to humiliate them. Yet, as they unfolded the pages, something unexpected caught their eyes. The headlines criticized the American government. Articles questioned military leaders. Columns debated the conduct of the war. In Germany, such open criticism was impossible. Every newspaper at home had spoken with a single voice, praising Hitler, glorifying the Reich, and damning its enemies. Here, the enemy's press openly admitted mistakes. The shock spread through the camp. If the Americans were willing to criticize their own leaders, then perhaps not every word they spoke was propaganda. A dangerous thought took root. Maybe the world was larger and more complicated than the Reich had allowed them to believe. Books deepened this realization. Shelves in the camp library held volumes of German classics, Goethe, Schiller, Heine, comforting reminders of home. But alongside them stood foreign authors, translated into German or offered in English. Some men opened Mark Twain and found themselves laughing at the absurd misadventures of Tom Sawyer. Others read Jack London, transported to frozen wildernesses filled with danger and resilience. These were not military manuals or political pamphlets. They were stories, alive with humor, struggle, and humanity. For many, it was the first time they had encountered literature free of ideological control. In Nazi Germany, even fiction had been bent to serve the state. Now, behind barbed wire, prisoners were free to lose themselves in tales that had nothing to do with war. It was both liberating and disorienting. A handful of younger soldiers began to teach themselves English from these books. They traced words slowly, repeating phrases under their breath, determined to unlock the meaning. Some even copied entire paragraphs into notebooks, practicing handwriting as though preparing for a different future. For teenagers who had spent their youth in the Hitler Youth, drilled to worship uniformity and obedience, the freedom of language felt intoxicating. Letters reinforced the change. Thanks to Red Cross coordination, prisoners could send censored notes home and, to their astonishment, receive replies. The ability to write about daily life, to hear from family still enduring bombings and shortages, restored a fragile bridge to the outside world. Those who had believed themselves lost now held paper proof that they were not forgotten. Each of these experiences chipped away at the certainty forged in Nazi indoctrination. They had entered captivity, convinced of a simple division: Germany as the pinnacle of civilization, America as a land of chaos and decay. Yet the press, the books, and the letters whispered a different truth. A society that tolerated criticism, celebrated imagination, and maintained contact with families seemed far removed from the barbaric caricature painted back home. For some, the cracks were terrifying. If the Reich had lied about America, what else had it lied about? Even after weeks of orderly routines, filling days with work, sports, books, and letters, the German prisoners still carried suspicion. They had been surprised by food, shocked by fairness, unsettled by newspapers and novels, but deep inside they remained wary. Something, they thought, had to reveal the cruelty they had been promised. The revelation came in the most unlikely form: light, flickering across a white sheet. It began quietly, almost without announcement. A few guards set up a projector in a hall that had been cleared of tables. Wooden benches were dragged into rows. A large sheet was stretched against the wall. Word spread through the barracks: the Americans were showing something tonight. Some imagined a lecture or a propaganda film, perhaps a stern speech about American victory. Still, curiosity was stronger than cynicism. When the lights dimmed, the prisoners found themselves staring at moving images larger than life. At first there was silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the machine. Then a cowboy galloped across a dusty plain. A gunfight erupted, followed by laughter and cheers. The men blinked in disbelief. It was not propaganda at all, it was entertainment. Real films, straight from Hollywood. The reactions were as varied as the faces in the room. Some sat rigid, unwilling to relax. Others leaned forward, mouths half open, caught in the sweep of the story. Hardened soldiers who had marched across continents now chuckled at slapstick routines. Teenagers who had been trained to salute flags and chant slogans grinned at the absurd misfortunes of comic actors. For the first time in years, many of them laughed without fear. The selection of films was deliberate but broad. Westerns dominated the early screenings. Cowboys rode across endless landscapes, fighting for justice, standing up to villains, carving out freedom with grit and courage. To German soldiers, the imagery was intoxicating. The landscapes themselves, vast, open, and filled with possibility, were unlike the bombed-out cities of Europe. The morality was simple, yet powerful, good and evil clashing under a wide sky, with ordinary men shaping their own destiny. Some whispered that the cowboy represented America itself, untamed, resourceful, unstoppable. Comedies followed. Charlie Chaplin stumbled across the screen, his clumsy brilliance drawing waves of laughter that rolled through the crowded room. The Marx Brothers unleashed chaos, mocking pompous authority figures with outrageous antics. To men raised under rigid discipline, such scenes were nearly unthinkable. Authority in Germany had been absolute, unquestionable, sacred. To see policemen, judges, and bosses ridiculed was shocking and liberating. The laughter they felt was more than amusement. It was rebellion against the iron weight of obedience. Musicals soon made their appearance. Prisoners watched glamorous stars singing and dancing in glittering costumes. Bright colours flashed, melodies filled the air, and the sheer extravagance was staggering. How could a nation fighting a world war still afford such energy, such celebration? The contrast to their own grim reality was painful. Yet for 2 hours they were swept into a different universe, one where joy was not rationed, where life could be playful, where beauty seemed endless. Romances struck another chord. On screen, men and women flirted openly, kissed passionately, argued, and reconciled with wit and warmth. German prisoners sat stunned. At home, images of women had been carefully controlled mothers, workers, obedient companions of the Reich. Here, women carried independence, charm, and voice. The cultural gap yawned wide, and it fascinated them. Some admitted quietly that they longed to see more of these women, their freedom hinting at a life unimaginable back home. Newsreels were woven into the screenings. They showed factories roaring with production, tanks rolling from assembly lines, fleets of ships stretching to the horizon. For prisoners who knew that German supplies were dwindling, these images were terrifying proof of America's might. Yet they were not delivered as heavy-handed propaganda. They came sandwiched between comedies and musicals, absorbed almost casually, their impact sinking deeper precisely because it was not shouted. The screenings were voluntary, no guard forced attendance, yet soon the makeshift theatres were packed every night they were offered. Men hurried through dinner to claim seats. They gossiped in the barracks about which film would come next, comparing favourite actors, memorising lines, humming songs. For a few hours, the fences melted away. The war receded. They were no longer prisoners. They were spectators, sharing in a culture far larger than themselves. The effect was profound. For some, it was simple relief, a chance to forget their captivity. But for many, it carried dangerous implications. They began to question the picture of America painted by Nazi leaders. If this society could laugh so freely, celebrate beauty so extravagantly, and criticize authority so openly, then perhaps it was not the decadent wasteland they had been told. Perhaps strength could be found not only in order and obedience, but in imagination and freedom. The guards noticed the change. Men who had once muttered defiantly about eventual German victory grew quieter. They no longer shouted about the Reich's destiny. Instead, they argued about whether Chaplin was funnier than the Marx Brothers, or which cowboy best embodied heroism. Teenage recruits, barely out of school, scribbled the names of actors into notebooks and tried out English phrases they had learned from the screen. For them, the films were more than entertainment, they were lessons in a new way of life. Even officers, tasked with maintaining discipline among their men, could not ignore the transformation. Some tried to dismiss the screenings as propaganda, warning their troops not to be seduced. But their arguments faltered when the men pointed out the obvious differences. If this was propaganda, it was unlike anything they had ever seen, free, chaotic, and filled with humanity. As one soldier muttered after a musical, "If this is propaganda, then it is the most beautiful propaganda I have ever seen." Night after night, the glow of the projector carved out a world within the camp. Soldiers who had fought bitterly against America now laughed at its comedians, admired its heroes, and dreamed of its women. The films bypassed ideology and touched something deeper, longing for freedom, for abundance, for a life beyond war. When the lights came up and the projector fell silent, the disbelief lingered. Men shuffled back to their bunks, whispering, "Can you imagine telling this at home? No one will believe us." And they were right. To their families in bombed-out cities, the idea of prisoners watching Hollywood films in captivity would sound like fantasy. Yet for those who lived it, the memory was real, seared into their minds as one of the strangest, most unforgettable chapters of the war. The screenings had already overturned much of what the prisoners believed about America. But even as they absorbed Hollywood's laughter and music, the most unsettling revelations came in the smallest, simplest forms, everyday foods that revealed the vast gulf between their world and that of their captors. It began with the canteens and camp stores. Prisoners, given coupons as symbolic wages for their labour, were able to exchange them for items at the camp's commissary. Cigarettes were the most popular, but what truly shocked them were the shelves lined with snacks, candies, and bottled drinks. Among them stood the unmistakable label of Pepsi, its colours bright, its contents fizzing. For men who had lived through ration cards and shortages, seeing such luxuries stacked in crates was bewildering. To hold a cold bottle of soda in hand was to realise, in a single sip, just how far America's abundance stretched. The sensation was unforgettable. Sweetness filled their mouths, a sharp fizz rushing across their tongues. Many had never tasted anything like it. Germany in wartime could not spare sugar, let alone devote factories to producing frivolous drinks. Some prisoners laughed aloud after their first swallow, calling it both ridiculous and miraculous. Others stared at the bottle as if it were evidence in a trial, proof that America's wealth was not a rumor but a tangible reality. Then came the hot dogs. At special occasions, holidays, sporting events, or simply when supplies allowed, the camps served them to prisoners. For the Americans, it was an ordinary snack, but for the Germans, it carried almost mythic weight. The sausage sizzled on grills, its smell drifting across the yard. The soft buns cradled the meat, mustard, and relish, adding flavors many had never encountered. One bite was enough to unsettle years of certainty. These were not survival rations. They were indulgences, cultural icons, tastes of a lifestyle that seemed impossible amid the rubble of Europe. To be handed a hot dog by a guard who treated it as nothing remarkable was to be confronted with the staggering difference between scarcity and surplus. The symbolism ran deeper than the flavor. A hot dog was fast, casual, inexpensive, yet filling. It represented a culture of plenty, where even prisoners could enjoy food that would have felt like a festival at home. A Pepsi bottle was frivolous, unnecessary, and yet everywhere. To the Germans, accustomed to hoarding scraps, it seemed the ultimate display of confidence, a nation so powerful it could waste sweetness on its enemies. Whispers spread quickly. Letters home, though censored, carried hints. "We are given foods that do not exist in Germany," one soldier wrote. Another confessed that he had tasted things so strange he could not even describe them to his family. At home, such words were met with disbelief. Mothers and wives, struggling to feed children on turnips and ersatz coffee, could scarcely imagine prisoners drinking soda and eating meat-filled buns. The guilt was sharp. Some men admitted they felt ashamed writing about their meals, knowing their families endured air raids and hunger while they enjoyed luxuries in captivity. Others simply avoided the subject, fearing that truth would sound like betrayal. Yet inside the camps, the conversations never stopped. How could Germany possibly win a war against a nation capable of feeding its prisoners like honored guests? The foods became symbols in nightly whispers. The hot dog was not merely a sausage, it was America's identity wrapped in a bun. The Pepsi was not simply a drink, it was the taste of industrial might, sugar, and fizz bottled into proof that the enemy lived in another world. Every bite, every swallow, chipped away at the certainty that Germany's way was superior. Some prisoners embraced the experience with fascination. Young men lined up eagerly, joking in broken English, repeating the brand names they had seen on bottles and wrappers. They began to treat these foods as souvenirs of captivity, memories they would never forget. A few even scribbled labels into notebooks, sketching the Pepsi logo with care, determined to remember what abundance looked like. Others resisted. Older soldiers, more loyal to the Reich, scoffed at the indulgences. They warned that enjoying American food was a dangerous seduction. Yet even they could not ignore the aroma of grilled meat or the laughter of comrades savoring something new. Resistance often melted in the face of hunger, and soon even the staunchest skeptics were chewing slowly, eyes closed, as the flavors carried them far from barbed wire. The guards themselves rarely noticed the impact. To them, handing out hot dogs or bottles of soda was ordinary, a gesture of routine hospitality. But to the prisoners, these moments were seismic. They were not just fed, they were confronted with the everyday proof that America was a world of plenty, so confident in its strength that it could share luxuries with its enemies. For years, the men had been told that power came from discipline, sacrifice, and uniformity. Yet here they learned another lesson. Power could also come from ease, from casual generosity, from the ability to offer sweetness even in war. In that realization lay the most dangerous crack of all, the laughter in the makeshift theaters and the taste of Pepsi and hot dogs filled the prisoners with astonishment. Yet beneath the surface, another emotion began to grow: guilt. Each evening, when the lights went out in the barracks, conversations shifted from amusement to unease. Men thought of their families back in Germany. They pictured wives standing in ration lines, mothers bartering for scraps, children hiding in cellars during bombing raids. They compared those images with their own reality: plates of food, cigarettes, soda bottles, even laughter at American comedies. The contrast gnawed at them. One prisoner whispered, "How can we write home about this? They would never believe us." Another replied, "And if they do believe, they will hate us for it." It was a dilemma that silenced many pens. Letters described daily life in vague terms, avoiding mention of luxuries. To admit that captivity offered more comfort than home felt like betrayal. Yet guilt was only part of the transformation. Doubt crept in as well. The films, the food, the newspapers, and the orderly routines challenged the worldview drilled into them for years. The Reich had promised strength through discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. But here, across the ocean, they saw strength built on abundance, confidence, and imagination. The dissonance could not be ignored. Younger soldiers were the quickest to change. Teenagers who had grown up in the Hitler Youth now found themselves humming tunes from musicals or imitating lines from Chaplin's films. Some practiced English phrases, scribbling words into notebooks and testing them on each other during work details. A few even began to dream aloud about visiting America one day, not as conquerors, but as men curious about a place that seemed so alive. Older veterans were slower to bend. They reminded their comrades that they were still enemies, that indulgence was dangerous. But even they struggled to maintain certainty. A sip of soda, a book that made them laugh, a glimpse of women on screen moving with independence, all of it worked like water dripping on stone. Slowly, inevitably, cracks appeared. The Americans seemed to understand the effect, even if they did not speak of it openly. Guards watched as once hostile prisoners softened. Men who had shouted about German victory now sat quietly, lost in thought. Work crews returned from fields, chatting about movies instead of the Reich. The energy of resistance drained away, replaced by something subtler: curiosity. Some prisoners began to imitate American mannerisms. They tilted hats like cowboys, whistled American tunes, or mocked authority figures in ways they would never have dared back home. At first, these gestures were small and private, but as weeks turned into months, they grew bolder. Whole groups adopted nicknames from films, reenacting scenes in the barracks with exaggerated accents. What had begun as distraction became fascination. The transformation was not without cost. For many, guilt deepened into shame. They wondered if they were betraying their homeland by enjoying the enemy's culture. They wrestled with questions they could not answer. Was laughter at a Hollywood comedy a betrayal of comrades still dying on the front? Was savoring a hot dog an insult to families scraping for survival in bombed-out cities? The conflict left them restless, caught between indoctrination and experience. At night, some lay awake, torn between two visions of the world. In one, Germany remained the eternal Reich, disciplined and superior, destined for triumph. In the other, America loomed as a nation of overwhelming wealth, confidence, and freedom. The two images collided in their minds, eroding certainty. For the Americans, this erosion was more powerful than any guard tower or rifle. Without firing a shot, they watched the enemy's conviction unravel. The films, the food, the books, the order, all of it worked together to reshape men who had once marched under swastikas with unshakable faith. The psychological turning point arrived quietly, without ceremony. One evening, after a film had ended and the lights were raised, A soldier muttered, "Perhaps they are not what we were told." No one argued, no one shouted him down. Instead, a heavy silence settled over the group, as if all had been waiting for someone else to say the same. From that moment, the change accelerated. The men no longer viewed everything as deception. They began to accept, however uneasily, that America's treatment was real. And in accepting it, they were forced to confront the possibility that their leaders had lied to them. For soldiers raised on certainty, nothing was more destabilizing than doubt. It spread quietly, like a shadow, darkening the certainties of the Reich and leaving in its place questions that could not be erased. By the time the war in Europe reached its final months, many prisoners no longer imagined a triumphant return. They feared instead the ruins they would face at home, and wondered if the abundance they had tasted behind barbed wire might forever shape the men they had become. As the war in Europe staggered toward its end, the German prisoners knew their time in America was drawing to a close. Rumors swirled through the camps, trains being prepared, ships waiting in the harbors, orders from Washington to begin the long process of repatriation. For months they had lived in a strange twilight world, trapped behind barbed wire but surrounded by abundance. Now they faced the prospect of returning to a homeland they barely recognized. The journey began much as it had when they first arrived, but in reverse. Trucks rumbled through quiet American towns, passing children who waved, fields that stretched to the horizon, and factories that still roared with production. The prisoners sat silently, staring out windows, knowing they were leaving behind a country that had shown them more comfort than they had ever expected. Some whispered that they would miss the food, the routines, even the strange evenings of cinema. Others refused to speak at all, afraid of the feelings that rose inside them. On the ships crossing the Atlantic, conversations returned again and again to the same theme. How could they ever describe what they had experienced? One soldier muttered, "If I tell them we watched American movies, they will think I am mad." Another replied, "If I tell them we drank Pepsi, they will think I betrayed them." Laughter followed, but it was nervous, unsettled laughter. The men understood that what they had lived through would sound like fantasy to families enduring bombings and starvation. As the ships approached Europe, dread began to replace anticipation. The men thought of their homes, many reduced to rubble. They thought of parents and wives struggling to survive on ration cards. The contrast between those lives and the comforts of captivity was unbearable. Some admitted privately that they feared going home, not because of punishment, but because they would never again see such abundance. When the transports reached German soil, disbelief unfolded on both sides. Families embraced returning soldiers with tears, but the stories that slipped out caused confusion. Prisoners spoke of meatloaf and potatoes, of books and sports, of laughter at Charlie Chaplin, of hot dogs sizzling on grills. They described soda bottles hissing open in their hands. To civilians scraping for food, the accounts sounded insulting, even cruel. Mothers snapped at sons who mentioned sweet drinks. Wives dismissed tales of movies as lies. Neighbors accused men of softening under enemy influence. Some ex-prisoners stopped talking about their experiences altogether. They learned quickly that the truth only bred anger or disbelief. Others shared the stories quietly, in whispers, as if guarding a secret too strange to say aloud. "They will not believe us," one man said, "but one day they will understand." Among themselves, the veterans could not forget. They remembered soccer matches played under the watch of guards, books devoured in lamplight, orchestras that filled the evening with music. They remembered the sharp taste of Pepsi and the indulgent warmth of a hot dog, symbols of a land that had shattered their certainty. Those memories followed them as they walked through ruined German streets, reminders that the world was larger than the Reich had allowed them to see. For many, the paradox became permanent. They had been enemies of America, yet they had lived as captives in relative comfort. They had been trained to believe in cruelty, yet they had discovered kindness. They had left their homeland to fight for a 1,000-year Reich, yet they returned with memories of American abundance burned into their minds. Years later, when asked about their time as prisoners, many veterans avoided the subject of labor or discipline, but when the topic of food or films arose, their voices softened. Some laughed at the absurdity, others admitted, with quiet seriousness, that captivity in America had changed them in ways they could never explain to those who had not lived it. They had crossed the ocean as soldiers of the Reich. They returned as men who knew a secret one that most of their countrymen would never believe. The memories of captivity did not vanish when the war ended. For many former prisoners, the experiences inside American camps lingered far longer than the barbed wire itself. What began as disbelief, the sight of Pepsi bottles and hot dogs, the glow of Hollywood films, evolved into something deeper, a legacy that shaped the men and, in time, their country. In the ruined cities of Germany, the returning soldiers carried stories that sounded unbelievable. Families listened as husbands and sons described soccer matches under guard towers, libraries filled with foreign books, evenings of laughter at American comedies. Some heard these tales with anger, others with suspicion, but for the veterans who had lived them, the memories were indelible. They had seen another way of life, and the impressions refused to fade. As Germany struggled to rebuild, fragments of those impressions resurfaced in unexpected ways. Men who had once dismissed American culture as shallow now recalled its vitality. They spoke of ordinary Americans who lived in comfort while the war raged, of a society where criticism of leaders was tolerated, where imagination seemed to flourish. Even the smallest memories carried weight: the fizz of soda, the aroma of grilled meat, the pages of Twain or London turned by lamplight. Together, they painted an image of a nation whose strength came not only from weapons, but from a culture of abundance and freedom. Historians later argued that these encounters were an early form of soft power. America had not set out to re-educate its captives through lectures or threats. Instead, it allowed them to witness everyday life, to taste, read, and watch the products of a society confident enough to share its wealth even with its enemies. This exposure worked quietly but powerfully, eroding certainties drilled into the prisoners since youth. When the Marshall Plan arrived to rebuild Europe, many of the men who had once been POWs recognized familiar elements. The crates of food, the consumer goods, the flood of cultural exports, these echoed the abundance they had seen in the camps. Some became advocates for cooperation with the West, convinced that alignment with America promised not humiliation, but renewal. Even in personal lives, the legacy endured. Veterans told their children and grandchildren about the films they had watched, the foods they had tasted, the books they had read. They described nights when music drifted across the barbed wire, when laughter filled a hall that should have been silent. They did not forget the paradox. They had been captives, yet they had glimpsed freedom in the smallest details. Not all memories were easy. The guilt of comfort lingered for many. Some refused to speak, ashamed to admit that their captivity had been less harsh than the suffering of loved ones at home. But silence could not erase the truth. In whispers, in private conversations, the stories passed on. Slowly, they joined the broader narrative of post-war Germany, a narrative that acknowledged defeat, but also pointed toward a new beginning. In the end, the legacy of Pepsi and hot dogs, of Chaplin and cowboy films, of letters and libraries, was not trivial. These were symbols of a larger transformation. They showed that even in war, culture could bridge divides, that humanity could survive behind wire, and that power could be expressed not only through force, but through generosity. For men who had once marched in the name of a 1,000-year Reich, the memory of captivity in America stood as a reminder of another possibility, a life built not on obedience and fear, but on imagination and abundance. The story of German prisoners in America can sound almost too generous, as though captivity had been transformed into comfort. But the truth was more complicated. Not every camp offered the same experiences, and not every prisoner walked away with gratitude. For some, discipline was harsh and unforgiving. Escape attempts were punished severely. Men who scaled fences or dug tunnels were tracked down, confined in isolation, and stripped of privileges. The Americans were not naive. They knew that thousands of trained soldiers could not be left unchecked. Guard towers stood for a reason, and barbed wire was not decoration. Behind every game of soccer or every library book, the reality of captivity remained firm. They were still prisoners of war. Work could also be grueling. Not every assignment meant picking vegetables in sunny fields. Some men labored in sawmills, cutting timber until their arms shook. Others repaired roads under the weight of heat and dust. The hours were long, and though the work was not designed as punishment, it often left men exhausted. The difference was not the absence of hardship, but the absence of cruelty. They were worked hard, but rarely beaten. Not every guard treated prisoners with indifference, either. While many enforced rules with calm efficiency, some carried resentment. They had brothers or friends fighting overseas, or worse, men who had been killed in combat. For them, the sight of German uniforms stirred anger. There were incidents of verbal abuse, rough handling, even occasional violence. Though such cases were often investigated and curtailed, they served as reminders that the system was imperfect. Geography shaped experience too. Camps in the South felt different from those in the Midwest or the Far West. Climate, local attitudes, and the nature of surrounding communities influenced daily life. In some regions, farmers welcomed prisoner labor with casual acceptance, treating them as temporary workers. In others, civilians glared at convoys, unwilling to see enemies in anything but chains. Children waving at passing trucks were not universal. The friendliness described in some accounts contrasted sharply with hostility in others. There was also the matter of hierarchy among the prisoners themselves. Officers clung to discipline, sometimes punishing their own men for appearing too friendly with the Americans. Hardline Nazis tried to enforce loyalty, threatening or intimidating those who showed too much interest in American culture. In certain camps, ideological battles raged behind the wire, creating divisions between those still loyal to the Reich and those quietly questioning it. For some prisoners, captivity was not only confinement by guards, but surveillance by their own comrades. And then there were those who never adjusted. For them, no amount of food or entertainment could erase humiliation. They sat in silence, refusing to take part in games, refusing to laugh at films. Their eyes burned with resentment, their minds fixed on the war still raging overseas. When they returned home, they spoke only of injustice, convinced that even kindness had been a mask for manipulation. The nuance matters. To tell the story as if every prisoner enjoyed hot dogs and Hollywood would be to erase the harsher edges of captivity. The United States treated its captives according to the Geneva Conventions and often went beyond, but it never forgot they were enemies. Barbed wire, searchlights, rifles, all were constant reminders of that fact. Yet acknowledging these counterpoints does not erase the broader truth. The majority of men found themselves confronted with a version of captivity they had never expected. Their surprise was real, their doubt genuine, their transformation gradual but undeniable. For every harsh guard, there were dozens who enforced discipline without cruelty. For every man embittered by captivity, there were many more who could not forget the taste of abundance, the sight of movies, or the feel of order without brutality. The legacy of the camps, then, was not uniform. It was a mosaic fragments of hardship, fragments of comfort, fragments of doubt. Together, they formed a story that defied simple categories. The story of German prisoners in America defies expectation. They arrived braced for cruelty, convinced by years of propaganda that captivity meant starvation, beatings, and despair. Instead, they discovered order, food, books, and films. They tasted Pepsi for the first time. They ate hot dogs grilled by their captors. They laughed at comedies that mocked authority, and they watched cowboys ride across landscapes larger than anything they had ever known. These experiences did not erase the reality of captivity. Guards stood watch in towers, barbed wire cut across the horizon, and escape attempts met with punishment. Yet the very fact that abundance could exist behind fences was enough to shake certainties. For many, it was the first time they realized that the Reich had not told the whole truth. Power, they learned, did not always come from fear and discipline. It could also come from generosity, confidence, and imagination. When the war ended and the ships carried them back across the Atlantic, the prisoners faced a dilemma. How could they speak of what they had seen? Families in ruined cities would never believe that their husbands and sons had eaten better in captivity than they had at home. They would not accept that prisoners had watched Hollywood films or written letters on clean paper while bombs fell on German streets. And yet the memories remained, carried silently within those who had lived them. In post-war Germany, whispers of these experiences spread. They became part of a quiet cultural bridge, preparing the ground for a new alignment with the West. Historians later argued that these moments, trivial as they seemed sodas, sausages, songs, played a role in reshaping how men saw the world. The seeds of doubt planted behind barbed wire grew into curiosity, and eventually into openness toward democracy and cooperation. Decades later, veterans still recalled the same images: the hiss of a bottle cap breaking its seal, the taste of sweetness on the tongue after years of scarcity, the warmth of grilled meat drifting across the yard, the flicker of a projector cutting through darkness. These were not just memories of comfort, they were memories of transformation. They had marched into captivity as soldiers of Hitler. They left as men who had glimpsed another world. And in that glimpse, through Pepsi, hot dogs, and Hollywood light, the seeds of peace were quietly planted.